I never told my son what his mother had put in the safe deposit box at First National on Ridgeline Avenue. My wife Eleanor made me promise, the winter before she died, that I would keep that secret until the right moment came. I didn't fully understand what she meant by the right moment, but Eleanor had always been the smarter one between us. She saw things I couldn't see yet. She planned for storms I didn't know were coming, so I kept my mouth shut, and I waited. The call came on a Thursday morning in late October, while I was sitting on my old army buddy Frank's back porch in Savannah, watching the Spanish moss move in the low Georgia wind. Frank had just handed me a cup of coffee and was settling into the chair beside me when my phone buzzed on the side table. It was my son, Daniel. I looked at the screen and felt something shift in my chest. Not panic, not exactly, more like the quiet recognition of a man who has been expecting a knock at the door for a long time. I answered, "Dad." His voice was tight, clipped. "Vanessa went to the bank this morning. She has some kind of document. She's telling them she has the right to access Mom's box." I set my coffee down on the wooden armrest, very carefully, the way you set something down when you don't want your hands to shake. "Is she still there?" I asked. "I think so. Dad, I didn't know she even knew about it. I swear I never told her." "I know you didn't," I said. "Daniel, listen to me. Go home. Don't go to the bank. Let me handle this." I hung up. Frank was watching me from his chair with the steady eyes of a man who had seen a lot in 68 years, most of it in places that had no names on any civilian map. "Trouble?" he asked. "Not for me," I said. "For her." I had been waiting for something like this for 14 months. Not the exact shape of it. I hadn't known it would be a forged document at a bank branch on a Thursday morning. But Eleanor had told me, from her hospital bed 3 years ago, voice already thin from the chemo, that whoever our son married would one day try to reach into our life and take something. She hadn't said it bitterly. She'd said it the way she said most true things, quietly, without drama, as if she were simply reading the weather off the horizon. Not all of them, I'd told her. I remembered trying to push back, the way you do when you're not ready to hear something. "No," she'd agreed. "Not all. But promise me you'll be ready either way." I had promised. And Eleanor had spent the last 4 months of her life making sure that promise had teeth. Let me go back to the beginning of this, because the beginning matters. Eleanor and I had built everything we had over 37 years of marriage. I'd started as a civil engineer with a county firm outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Eleanor had worked as an office manager for a medical practice. Neither of us came from money. My father had driven a delivery truck. Her mother had cleaned houses. What we built together slowly, carefully, reinvesting instead of spending, making decisions at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pocket calculator, arguing sometimes, always agreeing in the end. By the time Eleanor was diagnosed, we had the house on Creekside Drive paid off since 2019, a portfolio of index funds and dividend stocks worth just over $1.2 million, 2 rental properties in the Raleigh area, and enough in cash and CDs to live comfortably for a decade without touching anything else. We were not wealthy by the standards of people who have never had to worry about money, but we had security, the deep, quiet kind of security that takes a lifetime to build and can be destroyed very quickly by the wrong people. Eleanor had known that, and so, in the last year of her life, she had done something I'd thought was overly cautious at the time. She'd spent 4 months working with an estate attorney named Patricia Holden to restructure everything we owned. The house went into a revocable living trust. The investment accounts were retitled under the trust. The rental properties were transferred into an LLC. Eleanor had sat with Patricia for hours, going over scenarios, closing gaps, thinking through what might happen after she was gone. She'd been meticulous in a way that had sometimes made me uncomfortable, because her meticulousness was an acknowledgement of her dying, and I hadn't wanted to sit with that. But I had sat with it, and I had signed everything she put in front of me. The safe deposit box had been her final step. She'd put inside it the original trust documents, copies of every deed and account record, the LLC operating agreement, a letter from Patricia explaining the legal structure in plain English, and 2 sealed envelopes. One was addressed to me. One was addressed to Daniel. She'd told me the box existed and where it was, and she'd told me to give Daniel his envelope when the time was right, and not before. How will I know when the time is right? I'd asked. She'd smiled at me from that hospital pillow and said, "You'll know, Robert. You've always known more than you think you do." Eleanor died on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 years ago. Daniel had flown in from Denver the week before and sat with me through the last days. He was 31 then, working as a project manager for a construction firm, the kind of steady, practical young man who made his mother proud in ways she didn't always say out loud. He'd been seeing a woman named Vanessa for about 8 months at that point, had mentioned her a few times, shown me a photo on his phone once. She hadn't come with him to Raleigh for his mother's passing. She'd sent flowers, which I thought said something, though I couldn't have told you exactly what at the time. I met Vanessa for the first time 6 weeks after the funeral, when Daniel brought her to the house for a weekend. She was 30 years old, attractive in an expensive, deliberate way, with a sharp-edged intelligence behind her eyes that I noticed immediately. She was polite to me. She asked good questions. She laughed at the right moments. I found myself almost liking her, the way you can almost like a person who is performing likability rather than feeling it. It was a small thing that first caught my attention. We were having dinner on the second night. I'd grilled steaks, opened a decent bottle of wine, and Vanessa asked, with perfect casualness, whether I'd be staying in the Creekside Drive house long term, or whether I'd thought about downsizing. I told her I hadn't thought about it much. She nodded and said something about how a house that size must be a lot of work for one person. Very reasonable, very caring sounding. But it was the third question about the house. She'd asked where I'd grown up, and segued into whether the neighborhood had appreciated much. She'd asked whether I kept the yard work up myself or hired someone, and mentioned that her father always said a well-maintained property was the best investment. 3 questions about the house in the span of one dinner, each one wrapped in conversation about something else. I stored it away and said nothing. Daniel proposed to her 8 months later. He called me on a Sunday evening, voice bright with happiness, and told me he'd done it at a restaurant in downtown Denver, that she'd said yes, that he was happier than he'd ever been in his life. I told him I was glad. I meant it as much as I could mean it with the thing that was sitting at the back of my mind like a stone. The wedding was the first real indication that this was going to be a particular kind of problem. Vanessa had strong opinions about the wedding. That is the gentlest way I can put it. She wanted a venue in Scottsdale, an outdoor resort with a white tent and a string quartet, and a menu that included a raw bar and a custom cocktail designed by a mixologist she'd found on Instagram. She wanted 300 guests. She wanted a florist who, I was told, was very sought after, which I translated to mean very expensive. I sat with Daniel about a month before the wedding and gently asked him how the budget was looking. He told me, with the taut face of a man who was trying not to show stress, that it was coming to somewhere around $115,000, and that they were splitting it with Vanessa's parents, who were contributing $40,000. I did the math while he was talking. His share was roughly $37,000, which was most of his savings. I asked him whether he was comfortable with that. He said Vanessa really had her heart set on it, and he wanted her to be happy. I looked at my son across the kitchen table, this thoughtful, hard-working young man who had never asked me for anything, and I thought about the word happy and what it cost, and whether the price of making someone happy on a single day was a reasonable indicator of what the rest of your life with them would look like. I didn't say any of that. I told him I'd contribute $15,000 toward their share, so the weight wasn't all on his shoulders. He thanked me, clearly relieved, and I made a note in the back of my mind. The wedding was beautiful, in the way that very expensive things often are. Vanessa looked stunning. Daniel looked like a man completely in love, which he was. I danced with her once, a formal father-in-law dance, at the edge of the tent while a very skilled string quartet played something I didn't recognize. And she thanked me for being so supportive, and I said that Daniel's happiness was all that mattered to me, and she smiled and said, "He's so lucky to have you." She said it warmly. She said it like she meant it, but there was something in the way her eyes stayed, just a fraction too steady, the eyes of a person, listening very carefully to what is not being said, that I recognized from Eleanor's description of the storms that were coming. They moved to Denver after the wedding. Vanessa left her job at the marketing firm within 3 months of the ceremony. Daniel told me she was going to freelance, take on clients independently, have more flexibility. That was the language they used. In practice, she didn't work. Daniel's salary was $110,000 a year, which in Denver meant they were comfortable but not extravagant. Vanessa had different ideas about what comfortable meant. Over the following year, Daniel called me less. When he did call, there was a tightness in his voice that he always tried to hide. The calls were shorter, answers vaguer. I asked once, directly, whether everything was all right with their finances, and he said yes, fine. Everything was good. I didn't push, but I paid attention. I visited Denver in the spring, about 18 months after the wedding. They had moved from the apartment they'd rented after the ceremony into a house in a nicer neighborhood. A lease, not a purchase. At $4,200 a month, there was a new car in the driveway, a silver Mercedes SUV, which Vanessa mentioned she'd leased because her old car had been unreliable. The lease payment, Daniel told me quietly while Vanessa was upstairs, was $1,450 a month. I looked around the house, the new furniture, the art on the walls, the kitchen renovation. Vanessa had talked the landlord into funding in exchange for a longer lease term, and I thought about the $40,000 in savings that Daniel had gone into the marriage with. I thought about the wedding. I thought about the job she'd left. That evening, after dinner, I brought up the subject of my estate planning. Casually, over the dishes, I mentioned that I'd been meaning to get my paperwork in order and was thinking about sitting down with an attorney. Vanessa set down the dish she was drying and turned to look at me with an expression of complete attention, one, not sympathy, attention. She said that sounded very sensible, and asked whether I'd given any thought to how I wanted to structure things. I said I hadn't decided yet. She said, "Well, family assets should really stay in the family," and glanced at Daniel in a way that was designed to look like a shared couple glance, but was actually something else. Something more like an inventory being taken. I drove back to the airport the next morning thinking about Eleanor, and about Patricia Holden, and about the safe deposit box on Ridgeline Avenue. I thought the time might be approaching, but it wasn't yet. Not quite. What happened over the next several months was a slow escalation. Vanessa began calling me directly, which she'd never done before, calls that were friendly on the surface, full of interest in how I was doing, questions about the rental properties. Such a smart investment. "Robert, do you have a good property manager?" Questions about the Creekside Drive house. "Have you thought about the equity you've built up?" Questions about my plans for retirement. About whether I'd ever considered a reverse mortgage. About whether Daniel and I had talked about the future. Each call was plausibly innocent. Taken together, they formed a very clear picture of a person mapping a landscape. I always answered warmly and revealed nothing. Then came the incident with the rental property on Whitmore Lane. One of my tenants had moved out in August, and I'd been preparing the unit for a new renter repainting, some minor repairs. Vanessa called me to say she'd heard I had a vacancy, and wouldn't it make sense for her and Daniel to move into it temporarily, just to get out from under the expensive Denver lease, save some money, get back on their feet? She'd already priced the unit at below what I was asking from outside renters, and she had an explanation for why that was fair. She talked for 11 minutes. It was an impressive performance. I told her I had a renter lined up already. I did not have a renter lined up. I found one within 2 weeks. Daniel called me the day after that conversation. He sounded tired in a way that went past physical tiredness. He apologized, said Vanessa had been stressed, that things were tight. I asked him again, directly, whether he needed anything. He said no. I told him I loved him, and if he ever needed to talk, just talk. I would listen without judgment, no matter what. He was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line and then said, "I know, Dad. I know." I called Patricia Holden the following week and asked her to review the trust documentation one more time. She confirmed everything was in order. I asked her specifically about the safe deposit box and whether everything in it was current and accurate. She said yes. I also made a quiet call to the branch manager at First National, a man named Arthur Devereaux, who had known me for 20 years and had known Eleanor before she died. I told him that I wanted a note on the box, just a note, nothing alarming, that any request for access by anyone other than me should be flagged to me personally, regardless of what documentation they presented. Arthur said he understood completely. Then I took Frank up on his long-standing invitation to visit Savannah. I needed a few days away, and some part of me, the part that had inherited Eleanor's sense of timing, felt that if anything was going to happen, it would happen while I was gone. I was right. It took 3 days. The forged document Vanessa had brought to the bank was a medical power of attorney. It claimed that I had been declared incapacitated, and that she, as the wife of my son and my designated family representative, had the authority to access my accounts and safe deposit holdings on my behalf. It was a professional-looking document. The notary stamp on it was real. She'd found someone, somewhere, who had stamped it without witnessing the signing, which is a crime in North Carolina. The branch teller had looked at it, gotten nervous, and done exactly what she should have done, which was ask for a manager. Arthur had looked at it, recognized the name Robert Callahan from his notes, and quietly asked Vanessa to wait while he made some calls. That was when Daniel had called me. From Frank's porch in Savannah, I called Arthur first. He confirmed the situation, told me he'd already contacted the bank's legal team, and that Vanessa was sitting in the lobby with a cup of coffee and a smile, apparently confident that the matter was proceeding in her favor. I asked Arthur to give it another 15 minutes before telling her anything, and then I called Patricia Holden. Patricia arrived at First National 40 minutes later. I know because Arthur called me when she walked in. I found out afterward, from Daniel, what happened next. Vanessa had been patient and pleasant for the entire wait. When Patricia introduced herself as the attorney of record for the Callahan Family Living Trust, Vanessa's expression shifted in a way Daniel described as the face of someone who had just stepped through what they thought was a floor and found nothing underneath. Patricia explained, in the quiet, precise language of a woman who has had this kind of conversation before, that the document Vanessa had presented was not valid under North Carolina law, that I had not been declared incapacitated in any legal sense, and that even if I had been, a medical power of attorney of this type would not grant access to trust assets, which were held not in my name personally, but in the name of the Callahan Family Living Trust, of which I was the sole trustee. She explained that the safe deposit box was rented in the name of the trust, not in my personal name. She explained that she said all of this very calmly, as though she were discussing the weather. Vanessa said she'd been advised that the document was legitimate. Patricia said she understood, and suggested that whoever had given that advice had done Vanessa a significant disservice. Vanessa left the bank without the box. That night, I got on a plane back to Raleigh. Not because there was an emergency. Everything Patricia had put in place had worked exactly as designed. I flew home because it was time to talk to my son. Daniel came to the Creekside Drive house 2 days later. He drove from the airport with the look of a man who had not been sleeping, who had been sitting with a very large realization and didn't know yet what to do with it. I made coffee. I sat across from him at the same kitchen table where I'd had dozens of conversations over the years, where we'd talked about his college applications, about Eleanor's diagnosis, about his job offer in Denver, about the engagement, and I told him everything. I told him about the trust and how Eleanor had spent the last 4 months of her life building it. I told him about the LLC holding the rental properties. I told him about the prenuptial agreement which Vanessa had signed before the wedding, which had covered premarital assets on both sides, and which meant that everything Eleanor and I had built before that wedding was legally insulated from any divorce proceeding. I told him about the note I'd put on the box with Arthur. I told him about the call to Patricia. I told him that his mother had seen something, years ago, that I had only begun to see clearly after the wedding, and that she had built a wall around what we'd built together, not to keep him out, but to make sure no one could reach through him to take it. Daniel sat and listened to all of this without interrupting. His coffee went cold. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then, he said, "She never loved me, did she?" It wasn't really a question. It was the kind of thing a person says when they've already arrived at the answer and just need to hear themselves say it out loud. I told him I didn't know what was in Vanessa's heart, and that was true. What I did know and what I told him was that from the first dinner she'd sat at my table, she had been conducting an audit. That the job she'd quit, the lease, the car, the calls to me, the attempted break-in to a safe deposit box with a forged legal document, these were not the actions of a person who loved the man she was married to. They were the actions of a person who had made a calculation, and the calculation was coming up wrong, and she was trying to correct it. Daniel said, "What's in the box, Dad?" I told him it was time to find out. Together, we drove to First National the next morning. Arthur met us at the branch, shook Daniel's hand with the warmth of a man who had watched a boy grow up from the outside, and brought us back to the vault room. The box was a standard long unit, the kind that takes 2 keys. Arthur used the bank's key. I used mine, the same small brass key I'd been carrying on my keychain for 3 years, next to my house key and my car key, every single day since Eleanor put it there. The box held exactly what Eleanor had told me it would hold. The trust documents, the LLC operating agreement, the deed photocopies, Patricia's plain language summary letter, and the 2 sealed envelopes. I handed Daniel his envelope. His name was on it in Eleanor's handwriting, the careful, slightly formal handwriting she'd had since she was a schoolgirl in Greensboro. He sat down in the chair. Arthur had pulled into the vault room, and he held it for a moment without opening it. His jaw was working. I turned away and gave him privacy. I opened mine. I will not write down what Eleanor said to me in that letter, because that is mine, and it will always be mine. But I will say that Eleanor had understood, with a clarity that still takes my breath away when I think about it, everything that might come. She had understood it, and she had handled it, and she had trusted me to play my part, which was small and mostly consisted of keeping my mouth shut and waiting. At the end of the letter she had written, "You never needed to worry, Robert. You never did, but I know you did anyway, because that's who you are, and I loved that about you." I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. Daniel was still reading when I turned back. He read it twice, I could tell by the pace, the way his eyes moved back up the page. Then he held it in his lap, looking at the fluorescent light on the ceiling of the vault room, and I watched my son understand, at 34 years old, the full depth of what his mother had been. He said, "She knew." "She knew," I agreed. "She did all this before he started again. She was sick, and she spent her last months doing all of this. Because she loved you," I said. "Not because she was afraid of anything. Because she loved you, and she wanted to make sure that whatever happened, you had a foundation." He cried, then. The kind of crying a man does when he's been holding something too long and his arms finally give out. I sat next to him and put my hand on his back the way I had when he was small, and I didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. He filed for divorce 6 weeks later. Vanessa's attorney sent a letter demanding an accounting of all marital and family assets. Patricia responded with a letter of her own. The Creekside Drive house was trust property, not personal property, and predated the marriage by more than 20 years. The investment accounts were trust property. The rental properties were LLC property. The prenuptial agreement, which Vanessa had signed in the presence of her own independent attorney 14 months before the wedding, specifically excluded all premarital assets from any divorce settlement. There were no shared marital assets of any meaningful value, because Vanessa had spent the marital income and then some, and what remained was Daniel's salary account, which was his. Vanessa's attorney pushed back. They questioned the validity of the prenup. They suggested duress. They claimed Vanessa had not fully understood what she was signing. Patricia had prepared for this too. Eleanor had thought of it first, and Patricia had built it into the prenup structure. Vanessa had been represented by her own attorney, independent of our family, a woman named Gillian Marsh, who had spent 45 minutes going over the document with her client before Vanessa signed it. There was a notarized statement from Gillian Marsh confirming that the terms had been explained in full and that her client had signed voluntarily and with understanding. There was no duress. There was no confusion. There was only a woman who had looked at a prenuptial agreement and assumed it was a formality she would find a way around later. She had been wrong about that. There was also the matter of the forged document at First National. Arthur had filed a report with the bank's legal team. The bank had referred the matter to law enforcement. I did not push for prosecution. I discussed it with Patricia, and we agreed that the civil divorce proceeding made it complicated, and that the most important thing was the outcome for Daniel. But the existence of the report made Vanessa's attorney considerably quieter about aggressive claims. The divorce was finalized 4 months after filing. Vanessa received nothing from the Callahan Family Trust, nothing from the rental LLCs, and nothing from the Creekside Drive house. She received half of the joint checking account they'd maintained during the marriage, which contained just under $11,000, meaning her share was $5,400 and something. She returned the Mercedes at the end of the lease term. She had no choice, since it was a lease in Daniel's name, and he declined to renew it. She moved to Phoenix. I don't know what she's doing there, and I don't think about it much. Daniel moved back to Raleigh in the spring. He took a position with a firm here, a step up from what he'd had in Denver, managing larger infrastructure projects. He's living in one of the rental units on Whitmore Lane, the one Vanessa had tried to move into 2 years earlier at a fair market rate, which I deposited directly into the LLC account. He insisted on paying it. I was proud of him for that. We have dinner together most Sundays. Sometimes I cook, sometimes he does. We talk about his work, about the house projects I always seem to have going, about football and about the neighborhood and about the things that don't need much language between us. On a Sunday in June, about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, he came to the house with a bottle of wine, a good one, the kind Eleanor used to pick, and we sat on the back porch after dinner and watched the yard go dark. He said, after a while, I keep thinking about what she said in that letter, about the trust not being about money. What do you make of it? I asked. She said the legal structure was just a container, he said, like the thing that holds the real thing. And the real thing was she wanted me to have choices, to not be trapped. She said she didn't want some stranger's decisions to take away the choices she and you had worked for. He was quiet for a moment. She was right, he said. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. I want to do something with the money, he said eventually. When it comes to me someday, not just keep it. Use it for something. There's a program through the Engineering Association. They fund apprenticeships for kids from low-income families who want to go into the trades. I've been looking into it. I looked at my son in the last of the evening light. 34 years old, lean and steady. Eleanor's eyes and her way of arriving at things slowly and then holding them firmly once he had them. Your mother would have liked that, I said. He nodded. We finished the wine and watched the fireflies come up over the grass. And I thought about Eleanor planning all of this in a hospital room 3 years ago, already thinking past her own death, already thinking about what Daniel J's life might look like, already building something that would still be standing long after she was gone. She hadn't been afraid. She'd been practical. She'd been loving. She'd been the kind of person who sits in a hard situation and asks, "What can I do from here?" and then does it. The safe deposit box is empty now. I closed the account last month. There was nothing left in it that needed a vault. What Eleanor built isn't in any box. It's in the conversation Daniel and I have on Sunday evenings, and in the way he said, I want to do something with it, and in the way the house on Creekside Drive is still standing, still ours, still the place where his mother grew orchids in the kitchen window and argued with me good-naturedly about whether the oak tree in the backyard needed trimming. There are people in the world who look at a life someone else has built and think, how do I get inside it? How do I get a piece of what those people made? They approach a family the way a thief approaches a house, looking for the unlocked window, the loose hinge, the moment when someone's guard is down. Eleanor knew that. She'd known it in the abstract, the way a careful person knows that bad weather happens, and she'd known it in the specific, the way a mother knows her son and understands the vulnerability that love creates in a good person. She'd done everything she could do from the position she was in, which was a position of running out of time, and it had been enough. More than enough. I keep her letter in the top drawer of my desk, folded the same way she folded it, in the same envelope, with her handwriting on the outside. I don't read it often. I don't need to. But on some evenings, when the house is quiet, and the light is a certain way through the windows, I'll pull open the drawer, just to see the envelope sitting there, And I'll remember the winter she sat me down and said, "Promise me you'll be ready either way." And I'll think about how she asked me to carry a small brass key on my keychain every day without knowing exactly what it was for or exactly when I'd need it. And I'll think about how, in the end, I hadn't needed to do much of anything. Eleanor had done the work. All I'd had to do was wait and trust her and know when the moment had come. She'd told me I would know. She'd been right about that, too. She was usually right. That was one of the great privileges of 37 years with Eleanor Callahan, watching someone be right about the things that mattered, again and again, with a patience and a grace that I am still, at 63 years old, trying to learn from. Daniel still has his letter. I've never asked him what it says. He keeps it in the same envelope, with her handwriting on the front, and I suspect he reads it more often than I read mine, because he's still working through what she meant, and that is exactly right and exactly as it should be. Some things your mother tells you take years to fully hear. Some things she builds for you take years to fully understand. He's a good man, my son. He was always a good man. He just needed to find his footing again, and he has. That's all a father can ask for. That's all Eleanor ever asked for, in the end. That, and a promise. And I kept it.